Good afternoon, dear audience of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. On behalf of this institute, I welcome all of you from a very sunny and bright Winnipeg today. On behalf of the institute, I welcome again all of you to listen and participate in our 11th episode of Project IDEA webinar titled Media Literacy in the Fight Against Disinformation. IDEA stands for Identify, Demystify, and Empower Ukrainian and Russian diaspora living in Canada to fight disinformation on Ukraine war. This project is supported by Department of Heritage under the Digital Citizenship program. Dear audience, before I begin, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Dear audience, the program objectives of Digital Citizenship program are to enhance and enable Ukrainian and Russian diaspora living in Canada to understand the online harms coming out from Russian machineries during this Ukraine war. As I said, the project IDEA has three parts, and the three parts includes to prepare the artificial intelligence-driven tools to find out fake and disinformation related news in the social media and mainstream media, and to share ideas and expertise from the scholars and experts throughout the globe so that we understand what is happening in the realm of fake news and disinformation. Today, we have a special guest with us, Dr. Megan Fromm, the Education Manager of the National Association for Media Literacy Education in this webinar. Now, it is my privilege to read her bio. Megan Fromm is a journalism and media education expert. She has taught at both the university and secondary levels and has spent more than a decade working with student journalists and journalism teachers to better improve their craft and serve their communities. Megan is a former journalist and was the 2019 National Media Literacy Teacher of the Year. She is the co-editor of Transformative Media Pedagogies and co-author of Student Journalism and Media Literacy in 2024. Megan began her media literacy career as a PhD student at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland in 2006. As a teaching assistant for the college's media literacy course and an educator at the museum in Washington, D.C., she experienced firsthand how transformative media literacy skills are for young people. After finishing her PhD, which explored news framing of student First Amendment issues, Megan was lucky enough to teach students from around the world at various institutions as she and her husband moved often during his service with the US Air Force. In 2012, Megan joined the faculty of Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change, a summer study abroad program for students interested in using media to empower and achieve more just civic futures. From 2016 and 19, Megan also served as the Academy's curriculum lead. In 2014, she was elected to the Journalism Education Association's Board of Directors, serving as the Educational Initiative Director and leading the organization's curriculum efforts until 2020. Her most memorable classroom experience thus far, however, was advising high school student media in Colorado, where her students won multiple awards for their journalistic work. As I already alluded to, it's an honor to have Dr. Megan Fromm with us this afternoon, and we are going to listen next 20 to 25 minutes about her expertise and ideas about media literacy and how best we can benefit from her knowledge. Dear audience, we are also joined today with our advisor, Mr. Gary Senft, and our co-founder, Dr. Hilal Mohiuddin, who are going to join in the question and answer session. And now we are going to invite Dr. Megan for her initial remarks and presentation, and followed by Q&A session. Dr. Megan floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with everybody tonight and to talk about this. I think it's clear we're all so passionate about this, and we see how important it is to really not give up the fight in educating about media literacy and educating about disinformation. So I'm just thrilled to be here, and hopefully I can share some ideas for you. I'd like to go ahead and start my slideshow. My hope is to walk through a little bit about namely and just what we do, but then mostly focus on why disinformation seems to be so compelling for people. It's something that as I teach my students, I think I'll keep it in this view if that's okay. Keeps popping out to the other view. My students are really curious about, why does this stuff work? Why does disinformation hold so much power, and especially disinformation in the form of propaganda? And so I want to talk a little bit about what we know about why that is and sort of how our brains operate. I also hope that we can sort of, with that knowledge, think about interventions. So how media literacy and the skills and the habits can act as a buffer, a mitigator, sort of step into that space in between our own experience and propaganda, and hopefully guide us in a better direction. So I think it's important first to establish what we mean as an organization when we talk about media literacy. And so at the National Association for Media Literacy Education, we look at media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. One thing I want to point out that is really important to us is this sort of end cycle where we have some kind of creation. And I say end because it's at the end of my list here, but sometimes media literacy starts with creating. I think for a lot of young people, they are creating before they're analyzing and evaluating. And so we sort of look at the whole process of media literacy as multiple points where we can stop, educate, reflect, and maybe do better if we need to as a creator or as a consumer. So at any point sort of along this line represents an opportunity for educators, for activists to, become part of that moment and to help people understand what they're experiencing in the media. We really feel like the purpose of media literacy is to help individuals of all ages develop habits that they will need in this world. I personally always go so far as to say that media literacy is a basic human right. We live in an era where media literacy has become almost as important as clean drinking water. If we don't have media literacy and we can't function as a healthy citizen and participant in our communities, then our whole ecosystem falters. And so media literacy really is about the health of our communities, the health of our nations, and the health of our world. So to me, it's a basic human right. Our vision at Namely is to see media literacy highly valued and widely practiced as an essential life skill. So we look at it as not something that has to exist only in schools, but that should exist everywhere in the community, which is why programs like this, I think, are so important. We all have a part to play. It's going to take a big, big team to make a dent in what we are seeing. So we hope that it can become really widely practiced. We have a huge community of partners, and so we're always happy to join in any efforts that are strengthening media literacy education. And so these are just some of our partners. I won't belabor each one, but you can see we love to just work with people who are interested in making a difference in this space. So we work with professional media, we work with educators, we work with school districts, we work with other nonprofits. We also have a team that we call the National Media Literacy Alliance. And this is a group of teacher organizations in the United States where we work specifically with the groups who are serving teachers to make sure that media literacy education is at the forefront. And I'll mention, in case you're interested in learning more, we did just have our summer conference in July. In October, you could join us for Media Literacy Week. It's a week-long event where there are many, many different ways to participate in media literacy events. You could host your own. You could commit to be an educator or a supporter. It really means essentially you pick your own adventure to create something that is a media literacy moment for you or your community, and then you share it out and other people get to be inspired. So we've been doing this since 1997, but I will say, especially in 2016, from the United States perspectives, a lot of things changed. We had an election that sort of revealed the polarization in our communities. It revealed distrust. And I think for a lot of people, it revealed the extent to which media actually is impacting what we understand about our world. For those of us in the field, we knew that media was impactful, but I think it sort of became really common sense for the average American, and that changed things. And so what we've seen since then, and not just from an American perspective, is that there are a lot of challenges. We sort of live in an era of disinformation. Some people call it the era of post-truth. That sounds scarier to me. I don't know that I want to deal with this idea of post-truth. There's no truth. So I think this era of disinformation maybe more accurately categorizes where we are at. We know that volume and speed of disinformation is critical to understand. It spreads so quickly. I think I read a statistic earlier today, actually, that the number of people using platforms like Instagram, for example, doubles every year. That's been sort of their pattern. And there's probably a more specific number, but that was the general takeaway. So if you think of just the potential to reach people with disinformation and the magnitudes at which it is growing, this is obviously a huge challenge. And so I think we've been scrambling. I think from the academic perspective, I personally spent about 10, 12 years in higher education. I've written a lot on media literacy. I've written a lot about educating for media literacy. And one thing that remains true now, even as it was a decade ago, there's not a lot of consensus on how we mitigate these issues. And so things that we are starting to see is we can't cure it with facts. So we know that just by sharing facts, we might not change somebody's beliefs. We also know that some of the strategies we've been using, pre-bunking, so sort of establishing ahead of time this is a reliable source, or debunking, putting a check mark or a big X over it at the end, sometimes those work and sometimes they don't. They're really specific to the context. Sometimes we have a rebound effect where people see a fact check and they become even more entrenched. So, we're sort of building the plane as we fly it. I hate that metaphor because I want to find something that works, but I do think sometimes we are in that space. And then I think another challenge is that there is just a lack of capacity. There's a lot of wonderful people like here doing this work. There are educators who care. There are tech industries and tech corporations that are interested in making it better. But ultimately, despite all of that, the proliferation of disinformation is really hard to keep in check. It grows faster than our capacity and our systems can keep up with. So these are some challenges that I see. I also see some opportunities, however, in this era. I think that what we're starting to see with some of the research is showing us that media literacy matters, and it matters in context. So, sometimes we don't have broad sweeping solutions that we could apply to every scenario, but we're seeing enough to know, yep, it matters and it works. And so that is really invigorating for me. We've seen that media literacy classes, workshops, community panels, these different types of interventions can help people become more skeptical and use their skills for critical analysis. And we see it especially involving advertising, which for me, is a wonderful bridge into understanding what we could do for propaganda. And so some of the techniques for advertising are similar to propaganda. So I think we're starting to build a foundation that if media literacy works for people to understand not all ads are real, then maybe media literacy will work against something even as powerful as propaganda. So I'm hoping we can build on these solutions. So I want to talk a little bit more about, why is propaganda and disinformation so effective? And like I mentioned, my students really struggle with this. I think there are, even in the media literacy world, some conflicting, perhaps, definitions for propaganda. I've spoken with some scholars who, really feel like propaganda is 100% in the eye of the beholder. I've spoken with scholars who think propaganda only exists within really different power structures. So there's not always consensus. I think about propaganda as sort of the systems and the institutions that are feeding those messages. And I look at that and I compare it to the average citizen. And if that power imbalance feels really off, chances are we might be getting into propaganda if we're dealing with ideology, things like that. So while I won't offer a concrete, comprehensive definition of propaganda, I do want to talk about what it does to our brain. I always like to tell people that, propaganda, it was like the original fake news. My students, especially high school students, a few years ago, when that term was especially on the forefront of everyone's mind, they thought it was brand new. They thought this idea of fake news was brand new. And I had to tell them it's not. Countries, dictators, systems, institutions have been using fake news for a really long time. And so we talk about it as, how fake news or propaganda is meant to influence opinion, build support, that it often demonizes, it sort of widens, divides, paints things in really black and white pictures, that institutions that we might actually trust might actually use propaganda for their own personal or institutional purposes. I also think students start to recognize propaganda when they think about things like money and how much it costs to have a voice and to have a sway and to have a message disseminated. So, these are all things that for my own students and often in the communities that I speak with, when we talk about it this way, they start to see, okay, fake news, which we sort of just used as a catch-all, might have a lot more nuance to it. And so it would be really good for us to understand how that works. And then I always like to bring up this example, and let me just play the slideshow here because it will help. This was sort of one of the original examples of fake news, and most people are not familiar with it. And so I always tell students, this was before Twitter, before TikTok. So imagine how this spread without social media. So in 1983, there was a headline from a pro-Soviet newspaper called The Patriot. And this headline essentially said, AIDS might invade India, mystery disease caused by US experiments. Now, between 1983 and 1985, we didn't see that headline take off a lot. However, in 1985, that article was used as a source in a Soviet weekly. Between 1985 and 1986, also didn't gain a ton of traction, but then we see the story on the front page of a British tabloid. By 1987, that story had appeared in major newspapers of more than 50 countries. So imagine fake news in the pre-viral era. Between 1983 and 1987, in 4 years, for this story to have appeared in more than 50 countries. It really shows how viral disinformation can be and how quickly it can spread. And then I think it's important for people to understand that these messages have impact and they have consequences. So a study in 2005 actually found that almost half of African Americans surveyed for the study believed that HIV, the virus which causes AIDS, was man-made. And I have no doubt that these things were connected. Media messages that spread disinformation lead people to hold on to beliefs or to develop beliefs or change or impact their behavior. And that's why it's so critical that we do what we do. This is why we get up in the morning. So I want to talk about a few more things, just to understand, I think, about propaganda, about narratives. Narratives are really, really impactful. And sometimes people think, oh, well, I was entertained or I was amused. But they actually really foster very distinct processing modes. So when we're engaged in a story is being told to us, we're either listening, watching, doing both, maybe we're reading it. But these narratives actually shift the way that our brain is processing information. So, for example, and this is something that for my students brings some clarity, we talk about something called transportation imagery, or do we feel like we're transported into the story? The more that we can be transported into the story, the more that we actually tend to relate to that narrative, or we let our guard down and we stop using critical analysis processes and we start processing with the emotional side of our brain. So we can engage in a story that actually doesn't feel anything like us. It's very new to us. But if it is so immersive and engaging that we sort of forget where we are, we might be being impacted in a stronger way. Another thing that I think is important for people to understand is sometimes we are impacted if we feel the story is real. So this idea that we comprehend there's a realness and an authenticity to the story. And this is where propaganda really makes some waves, because propaganda tends to use what looks like real situations or what are real people or real news clips and real audio and real photos, but they're mashed in a way that has actually no basis in truth. But because those things are real, we perceive it to be more real, and these stories start to have a greater impact on us. We might think about, do we engage with characters? So this is an important media literacy concept, this idea that if we see somebody in a narrative or a story that we can relate to, we are more likely to elaborate on that story in our own brain. So we're more likely to build on it and to make mental connections and to really start to get involved. And so what this means for us, and to me, this is a quote that sometimes chills me a little bit, but this idea that when we are audiences and when we are processing messages and we are so focused on making a connection with the story, we actually do not have the cognitive resources to generate counter arguments. And this is why propaganda works. Propaganda also uses myths. Myths are really, really big stories, and they're stories that help us construct sort of an idea of order, like what is happening in the world. They help us understand conflict or contradictions. We can see big stories or myths within conspiracy theories, right? Because they bring order to chaos. They help us understand why something might have happened in a way that doesn't make sense to us. And we also see that these myths or these big stories, they sort of bring definition, they bring clarity. The human brain does not like nuance. We like black and white, we don't like gray. And the truth is very complicated. The truth is usually nuanced. And using these big stories help us to apply categories that sort of calm down our nervous system when it is overprocessing or feeling threatened by information. And so these myths start to become what we understand of common sense. And we can see this in stereotypes that are really often activated with propaganda and disinformation. They become these ideas that we don't actually question, because they seem to be so ubiquitous, when in reality, they should be questioned. So if we put together this idea that narratives are really impactful because we become immersed and we let down our guard and we stop critically processing, if we combine that with this idea of myths and big stories, we can start to see why propaganda takes hold. It becomes so, that idea of common sense, so commonsensical that people who criticize it find that they're met with a lot of adversity. And because we talk about conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists talk about their theories in really broad ways, it's difficult to critique. There's not that focus on nuance. So these propaganda messages, or these messages of disinformation that are myths and stories, they often sort of serve to certify themselves or to reify what people already think. It becomes almost conventional wisdom, which becomes hard to sort of argue against. And I think we see this a lot right now with propaganda, that propaganda and disinformation to people who believe it feels so common sense that they shut down conversation. Like, why would we even need to talk about it? Because it's already been reasoned through. There are enough people who believe in it. There are enough people on the other side to prove that there's a defense, and we should be argumentative. That why should we even start to question it? So it becomes almost this idea that these messages are a given. Some other reasons that we see with media literacy that people fall for conspiracy theories, which I think also represent a moment for us to kind of jump back in and hopefully mitigate. We know that propaganda and conspiracy theories have really simplified explanations. So they just sort of cut out all of the extra, the detail, context, facts, small facts, and they just give these really simplified blanket explanations. We also see that people engage in motivated reasoning, which is sort of a sense that they are seeking information that already fits what they know to believe. So there's some selection bias in that. They also are motivated perhaps for emotional reasons. And so they are seeking to fill an emotional need. And when we try to find information to fill an emotional need, we're not often making very good choices. With disinformation and propaganda comes a sense of belonging. If you believe in disinformation or a conspiracy theory, you become part of a club. And there's research that points to we really need a better understanding of isolation and individualism, because people who are falling for conspiracy theories often report that they feel socially isolated in their own lives. So they are seeking a way to be connected, and all they have to do to be connected is believe, and those communities open their arms and let them in. And then we have these really typical cognitive biases, right? So selection bias. There's something in media called the third person media effect, where we think that everybody else is less intelligent with media than we are. We get it. We're good. We don't fall for it, but we worry about everybody else instead of worrying about ourselves. So there are tons of reasons why our brains are sort of working against us. And one of my favorite resources for understanding some of these in the context of news, such as what's happening in Ukraine, comes from the Newslit Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization, but it's newslit.org. And so our brains are making it harder for us to do this job. Our brains are making our lives just more difficult every day. There's something called the continued influence effect. And this idea of the continued influence effect is essentially saying that, people want to continue to see things that they already believe. So once we're exposed to misinformation, it's hard to get it out of our heads. Corrections tend not to work. The implied truth effect, which is a major problem for media platforms. So Twitter or Facebook or even TikTok is trying to fact check, and they might apply like a sticker or some other visual to say, yep, this information is good. But because they can't possibly label every post, it implies that those that aren't labeled as true or false must be true, because if they weren't, they would have a false label on them already. So these are platform issues that we need to work on fixing as well. The tainted truth effect is another interesting thing that our brain does. And what sort of happens is that corrections and warnings against disinformation or propaganda, they sort of create a sense of distrust, right? Somebody is saying, stop, don't trust this. And so it can make people start to be cynical and have total doubt that anything they see could be true. And then it makes it hard to reach them with what actually is true. And then, of course, repetition. So the more you hear something, the more you believe it is true. And repetition can also make these beliefs seem like they are commonplace when in fact they actually aren't. So media cover conspiracy theories, and in doing so, they amplify conspiracy theories and they amplify propaganda, and it makes those messages seem even more widespread. I mentioned cognitive bias, and I do want to give a definition for that. So this idea that it's like any limitations in our thinking, and they cause flaws in our judgment. So thinking through this idea that we might have this annoying sort of brain glitch that is leading us to faulty conclusions. And we've seen this in research in many, many different ways. So this is a really solid concept in media literacy. Confirmation bias is another sort of tactic that our brain uses to create shortcuts and make things easier. We seek out things that we actually want to believe without trying to actually seek out credible information. It's really hard for people to make that distinction. This is sort of a newer idea in media literacy that I think is getting more attention than it used to. But this idea that, humans are really social. And so we value our friendships, we value our relationships with family. And so we don't want to lose that. So we might be more likely to adopt new beliefs, even if we don't fully believe in them. So people who are especially culturally diverse might selectively credit or dismiss evidence in what they see in order to stay within their identity or their group. So they're being very protective of their identity as it relates to belonging to that group. So as you can see, we want to belong, we want to be devoted, we want not to have conflict in our brains. And so all of these things are sort of working against us, and then technology has made this pretty easy. We also are fighting something called the illusion of explanatory depth. And this is the belief that we understand things more than we actually do. So I know for me, I always try to practice. There's probably an expert out there on any given topic, right, that we could turn to who's going to say something differently than, the expert next to me. So it's easy for me to, sort of say, I know what I don't know. But if you're not in this field, it might not be easy to say, I don't know that. For propaganda and for conspiracy, we also see that people find patterns where they do not exist. So we start to see connections and relationships simply because the world is chaos, and we're trying to bring order to it. And so we perceive that things are related when they are not. we found this a lot in America with the election, that conspiracy theories are also becoming a more common way for people to explain something bad happening to them. And so for folks who lost the election in 2020, they could only explain that through conspiracy theories because none of the logical ways made sense to them if they were really emotionally attached to that election and to that outcome. Then they were more likely to rationalize what happened through a conspiracy theory. Another thing that happens is that people look at the very first thing they read, and that is where they base their opinion, and they rely too much on it. So we call that anchoring bias. And so I know I'm throwing a lot of things out here, and I'm going to wrap it up because I want to take questions. But I think it's important to sort of ask, okay, so given all this, maybe I don't even need to ask this question anymore. Why can't facts change our minds? But I think it's important to reiterate a few things that media literacy scholars are teaching us right now. Number one, it's not about being smart. So media literacy skills aren't really about intelligence or IQ. They definitely activate critical thinking skills, which are a different part of the brain, but people will have different types of cognitive sort of skill sets, right? So you have highly emotionally intelligent people, you have analysts, you have people who are creative minded. So the brain works in all of these different ways, and it's not as simple as saying these people just need educated. So it's not about intelligence. And we have to just remember we're going against our hardwired brain almost at every point when we encounter information online in the ecosystems we exist in online. And that once we do form conclusions, it's really hard to change, even when we're presented with that evidence. And we don't seek things out neutrally. We don't come from a point of objectivity. We definitely come from a point of bias, and we tend to seek what we want to see. And I'm going to skip to, I told everyone beforehand, I put in a lot of slides so I can jump around and show you evidence if we want to go there. But I want to skip to something else real fast here. And then I want to wrap it up and we can take questions. So given all of these sort of, big picture understandings of how our brain works, where does media literacy sort of step in? And there are a couple things we can think about. We can think about, do we need to understand a specific skill set to analyze a specific message? So do we need to do propaganda analysis? And here are some questions we can ask for that. Another thing we might think about is, do we need habits? So habits for just access, habits for our emotional response. There are all these different skill sets that media literacy can include. And part of, I think, what we need to do is help people understand which skill sets to bring out at different times. So for example, if I'm analyzing propaganda, or I want my students to analyze propaganda, I want them to walk through some of these steps. So I want them to do a reality check. I want them to be thinking about what is accurate and inaccurate in the content of a media message. Now, for something like Russia invading Ukraine, my students, and even myself, we don't have a deep historical background. I'm not a scholar on these conflicts. So my ability to assess what's accurate and inaccurate is probably not as good as somebody else's. And then I can say with decent confidence, same goes for my students, right? So part of this process is going to be a reality check, not just about accuracy, but it's going to be a reality check about what I already know. And people aren't great at self-assessing, that metacognition and like thinking about how we actually process. So we want to encourage people to do that. And we want to take away like the shame in that, right? We want to say there's no shame in not knowing what might be accurate or not, but you have to recognize that, and then you have to like take the next step. So these are other habits, right? thinking about, okay, who is benefiting from this message, from the distribution? So when we see, for example, some of the different depictions of what's happening on TikTok, and Russian disinformation has been pretty strong on TikTok, at least it was at the start of their invasion. And so we might think about, okay, well, who's benefiting from that? Who owns TikTok? Where is the money going? Where is the money coming from? We can think about what's left out, what's omitted. We can think about our own values check. So do we feel emotionally tied to this message? What's our reaction? If my first reaction is rage or fear or anger or these really like high valence emotions, that is a great red flag to say, calm down, stop, think more critically, take a deep breath. And then some of these that you're all probably really familiar with, right? Are there stereotypes? Are the solutions too easy? Do I need to like read between the lines and see what is implied versus what is stated directly? And then this last sort of analysis step is really important for media literacy habits. We want to get people to a place where, yeah, they're thinking critically, but then they're also doing something about it. And hopefully, if they don't understand the message and they don't know if it's real, hopefully they save it for later. Like they just put it away. Like they're not going to repost it. They're not going to reshare it. They just sort of put it in their pocket and save it for later until they can come to a better assessment. I think all too often people don't do this and they just hit share. And then we have to practice these all over again. So, there are other techniques for thinking about propaganda in context with media literacy. Definitely, we want to think about what are the techniques in the platform itself, symbols, strategies, technology, maybe it's background music, maybe it's filters. Like, how are these things being used to activate our emotional responses? So when we think about bringing media literacy as an intervention, what I am always thinking about is what is the one thing in all of these different skill sets that I can get somebody to do in the moment when they are face to face with propaganda. And that's not going to be the same for everybody. And I think that's our challenge. So I'm going to stop there. There's a ton more that I could share. And I'm so happy to also share these slides in whatever way is best. I wanted to come kind of like fully loaded here with lots of good stuff, but I want to open it up for comments, conversation, questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Megan. I think these are loaded with information and knowledge, and I think all are important, but we do have that format of having it in an hour or so. Thank you so much once again for putting so much energy into these slides. So now we are going to have these question and answer session here, as we have already announced. But before I invite our advisor, Mr. Gary Senft, and our co-founder, Dr. Hilal, to this session, I have received a wonderful question from our audience, and let me flash it here for Dr. Megan to kindly review. And if you care to answer, we would appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful point, actually. And when I talk with my students, one thing that I have found, and it's going to be very different depending on like your community and for me, like what school I'm at. So this conversation is very different depending on where I'm at. But I've actually started to find over the last 5 or 6 years, when I have taught in places that are pretty homogenous, so there is like a dominant culture, that students themselves talk about themselves as not being culturally diverse. And so we have to really take some time to actually point this out, that this exists even in a classroom where everybody looks the same and we think everybody came from the same demographic or economic standpoint, that there is cultural diversity. And students, I'm finding, are sort of less, I don't know if they're less comfortable talking about it or they don't see it as much. I think that varies sometimes. So for me, I put it that way specifically because it's something I have to talk about with intention with my students of like, yeah, you might think looking around the room that everybody is the same as you because you are all at the same school. You might all look sort of similar, but you're really not. And so then we do dig into that with different in-class exercises and things like that. Like, what are their cultural lenses? What are their religious or spiritual lenses? What are community values versus family values? What are values that they were taught through school systems? We absolutely teach values like in schools, whether we mean to or not, you know? So all of that becomes part of that conversation. So I don't know if that answers that question or sort of addresses that point, but thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Megan. I think it's another wonderful response because we all have our own biases, if I may call it, because we have our own value systems in place once we judge a situation. So let me welcome now our advisor, Mr. Gary Senf, to the floor. Gary, floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead with your question.
Well, Megan, thank you very much. It's a difficult area, and you brought a lot of clarity to some of the thinking. One of the scary points that you did very well in documenting there was that perhaps people are wired to go down that rabbit hole, and that's an interesting thing. So, what is there to save us, so to speak? And you provided some of those as well, and sort of critical thinking is a word that you used on a few occasions. Maybe healthy skepticism. So when you're looking at something, just start with the proposition that if it seems a little strange and out of shape, maybe in fact it is. You talked a little bit about fact checking, and what I found difficult there is what you're saying is even with good fact checking, it may lose its power, so to speak, a little bit. I followed with interest with CNN when they were doing fact checking, and they were coming up with like thousands of problems, and maybe it started to wear off on us a little bit. But have I missed some that you think just are really good high points to stop us from going down the rabbit hole?
I think those are absolutely the big ones. I think another one that I didn't talk about too much is actually a need for us to reframe how we talk about bias, how we educate about bias. I think that for many and I've taught high school up to college, and I find that by the time students, get to college, they've heard this word bias. They hear it all the time. Like, it's not new. And yet there is still so much stigma attached to acknowledging the biases that we all have. And so I think we need to do a better job, at the younger ages of helping people understand like bias doesn't have to have a negative connotation. It simply is how our brain adapts and how it works in ways that our brain thinks is serving us. And then now it may not be. And so I think we want to do a better job of helping people come to terms with and self-identify those cultural lenses and those biases. And they may not be cultural biases. They may come from other realms of a person's life, but there's a lot of shame attached to that. So I do think we need to sort of rethink how we teach things like bias. I think it's similar to a lot of the conversations that America in particular is struggling with in terms of how we teach about race and how we teach about racism. Racism has become this term that sort of, if you talk about it, you're automatically putting somebody in a black box that will ruin their reputation and all of these things. When in reality, like, we all have different biases, and for any number of us, that can manifest itself in ways that are negative. And racism is a negative manifestation of those biases. So I think we have to work on like taking shame out of these conversations so that we can be really honest about how we are experiencing the world, how other people are experiencing the world, and that we can start to better see how we're impacting people because of that. So that would be another place I think we should start.
Thank you. Another maybe quick one. So you mentioned that propaganda has been around for a long time, so it's not new per se, but social media has certainly grown in power. so now it's more prevalent. But it still takes some motivation to actually spread disinformation. So in a way, there's a moral wrong in doing that. Why is there so much moral wrong going on right now?
Well, and I think the question I would ask is, do the people spreading it always know they're spreading it? I think they don't always know they're spreading it. We are seeing in the research that people think sharing disinformation is a way to debunk it, when in reality, we're like, just stop sharing it. Like, no amount of media attention to these rumors and propaganda and disinformation is good. Like, just don't share it. And so we need to teach people that too. So I think there is, I mean, certainly I think the morality of it and how we talk about impact is important. Coming from sort of the media scholar side, there is still, and also having been a journalist, I think there's like this discomfort in, we know media matters. We know it impacts people. And we're seeing that in really real, kind of scary ways. And yet we also know media can have benefits and really positive impacts. And so it's almost like, if we admit that it can have these wonderful impacts, we've got to admit that it can have these really disastrous ones as well. And then we have to like have that conversation. And that morality is uncomfortable for, I think, a lot of people. And we won't always get it right too. Educators are not going to get it right. Our students, media professionals. So I think we will also have to think about how we exist in a world where we're going to mess a lot of this up before we figure out how to make it better. And we need a little space to do that. And that is tough when there are these moral sort of, issues behind it.
And maybe as a final point, accountability is part of the problem. And so you're mentioning it's a bit frustrating from time because you can teach the issues and the problems and how to respond, but finding a way to find accountability in our systems is something that's been lacking. Do you see sort of the Alex Jones and InfoWar development in a court as perhaps being something that will have quite an effect?
I hope so. I hope so. Watching that unfold has been just a media literacy moment that I think everybody is so eager to see how that impacts the world. And I do hope that it is an extraordinarily cautionary tale for people. My PhD work is around First Amendment issues as well. And a lot of times we sort of say, but what about free speech and what about free expression? But that accountability piece, we have to have that. And, in a world that has laws and, even some social norms and things like that, we expect people are going to push those boundaries. But to see accountability work and to come back into play and sort of like, levy that accountability has been promising. Yes. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic that if Alex Jones can be the cautionary tale, that perhaps we will start to see this pendulum swing, but I don't know.
So I wanted to end, Kauser, my questions on the hopeful note. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you. So let me welcome our co-founder, Dr. Hilal Mohyuddin, into the discussion. But just to be cautious about time, we are absolutely at the last end. So Dr. Hilal, please go ahead with your question, sir.
Oh, thanks a lot, Megan. It's a wonderful discussion, and I was thoroughly enjoying it. My point is about confirmation bias. Most of the time, as you say, that our human brains are wired, and we love to hear what we love to hear. So that's the condition. And whenever we are taking a hypothesis, probably and checking online, some other people seeing that no, there are a lot of information. Something, it's wrong information. I got it, and I'm believing it, I'm liking it, I'm going to share it. And right at that moment, I'm checking online. I'm not going to check it online whether it is true or wrong, but I'm going to check how many people are thinking the same way like me, and they are also believing that it is true. So the confirmation bias is, I think, one of the most important thing that we need to take into consideration, that you have already brought in discussion. There are different types of biases. Because I have seen, I'm in teaching profession and I am seeing it every day. Through plagiarism, it's expanding in the academic circle through plagiarism. Students are taking a lot of information, extracting information from online, and then putting in their assignments, their class notes everywhere here and there. We have softwares just to punish them, just to punish them and tell them don't do that. But it's not really media literacy, part of media literacy. We are making them cautious that if you do this, you will be punished. So this is one thing, that confirmation bias, whoever is being able to utilize this power, like at this moment, Russia, they are using different channels and people are having fun in all those information because they are juicy, they are tasty, they are really consumable, and these are consumer goods. The other day I was presenting and I was just talking about this thing, that it's a consumer product, so people are having it sugary, they are consuming it, not only consuming, they are sharing it because they think that it's their social and cultural responsibility. And when we are sharing, most of the time on Facebook, Twitter, and other places, liking, sharing, or commenting. It's a kind of cultural preoccupation. Like we feel it's my moral obligation. He is my friend. I know this guy. He is known famous person. I see it every day because I am a little bit quite active on Facebook. And when I post something, I see that some people just flood it with a lot of likes and loves and care emos, even not reading out what I have written. There are sometimes there are some wrong things. And one of my friends was experimenting a few days ago with some false information, just putting something because she's also very popular. So she was putting something, and then people were just liking and sharing. And then in the next post, she said, "No, look, it was an experiment. I was just checking how many people were really reading it and how many people were really checking it. I also did that myself in at different points." So that's quite important. That confirmation bias is really uh, something not only psychological, but it has social and cultural connotation. We think that we can't socialize in person in a party here and there because in real life we are dealing with a lot of struggles. So Facebook or media, social media, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever we have, these are the means, these are the ways we can connect with people and we can socialize. People have a tendency to socialize and they are showing that, look, we are with you and we are connecting with you, we are your relatives, your friends, just we are not out of the loop. This is one important thing that I am thinking we might need to discuss in media literacy and bring it to our students. Second one, it's my comment actually, not any question to you. Um, my comment is like YouTube. It's a money, it's commodity, it's a product. When you are putting something, a TikTok video, and if there is 1 million like, you are earning money. After 1,000 or something, YouTube the same thing. So view matters. And then whose accountability? Like Gary already put that in perspective, that point. Probably we need to make YouTube more accountable. We can't be accountable because I am enjoying this information, and that's why I'm going after this, and I am sharing this small TikTok video, and it is being flooded everywhere online, maybe getting 100 or 1 million views in a day. I am not going to check for reality check. I'm not going to debunk it. But the thing is that I am enjoying it, and I think that I enjoyed it. My friend will enjoy it. My family members will also enjoy it. I am sharing it and other things, and that's how the views are going to be increased in bigger numbers, and they are making money. So people are after money. Mostly they are after money, and now the ethics question should come there. That how should we make a bridge between ethics and then this commodity and then people's sensibility, because we're losing sensibility. It's not our problem, it's not our, you can't just blame us because the system is there, the capitalist system is there. It has created this fundamental lure. It is alluring us just to have more views. I am creating a content, we are using the term content, even not
Absolutely.
information. We are talking these days that okay, we are using disinformation, but we are labeling it as content. So we are content creators. We are creating content and people are viewing it. Our tendency is just to have maximum views. That's going to be 1 million, then I will be making some money. That's the main problem. And probably that market dynamics need to be brought into our students' knowledge, that look at the view, how many views it got. And this view is different from a music. I liked John Lennon's song, right? One song, and it has 1 trillion view. That's fine. It is something different. People are enjoying it. It is something different. But one YouTube or a one TikTok video which is just trolling someone's information or spreading disinformation, it is getting 1 million view in hours is really concerning, not the other one. So we need to make that distinction as well. Thank you very much, and it's a very wonderful discussion today. Thanks for bringing all these media literacy matters. In my last discussion, I was just pointing to that finally in my conclusion that media literacy is the most important thing at this moment.
Yeah.
You need to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are great points. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Dr. Hela, thank you so much for your, I would say, very comprehensive comments. Dr. Megan, you can respond to Dr. Hilal, but we are just absolutely at the last part of our session. But traditionally, we go back to our presenter, speaker, guest to listen the last words from them with regards to the topic itself, the future of media literacy. And I just wanted to bring one context here before I request for your last words. The audience, Dr. Megan, candidly explained what it means to be media literate in today's world, and why it is so difficult to be aware of these biases that leads to a different whole dimension and make us believe something that possibly is not correct. Remember, in one of our slides, she showed us news research result that in 1986, within a span of 5 years, simple news from India could capture, could be published in 50 countries, major news outlets. It took 4 years to 5 years to go there. But just for your information, today it takes possibly 5 minutes, even less, through the technology, through the phenomena that Dr. Halal and Dr. Megan rightly mentioned a number of times, through the sharing platform and technology. So it is even more complex in today's world, just to remain aware of what you are sharing in terms of disinformation and misinformation. And on a last note, let me add here that I remember very well as a researcher in the area of extremism and violence. During the Buffalo attack, we were watching the tweets and a couple of social media channels, and we have seen people are begging others that do not share the manifesto of the killer who has shared it for very intention of others to know what is written there. So vile, so destructive, so damaging. And this is what is important. Dr. Megan is asking all of us through her presentation that please be aware before you click and you share, because unknowingly, unbeknownst to you, you are going to share a very dangerous message to all. So, Dr. Megan, your last words for our audience and for us as well this evening. Go ahead, ma'am.
Well, thank you again for having me. I would say, two things continue to be top of my mind and what I think about in my daily work. And I think the first one is this idea of sort of compassionate exchange, right? With people who are interested, who have all of these different perspectives. And in doing that, we can figure out perhaps the next best way to fight it. And I always learn something new every time I talk with folks about this. I'm still thinking about Makarian's statement, for example, the idea of culturally diverse, which is like the researcher's language. But, that comment is making me think about, okay, how should I communicate that differently on the slide? And because communication is essential to human understanding, we have to be really open to that kind of feedback. So that's like top of mind, just compassionate exchanges where we can be open to feedback. On the other hand, all those systems of accountability are also at the top of my mind. So I would say, yes, citizens have these tools. We can practice different skill sets. we can be more media literate, but we definitely need to be looking at institutions and systems and asking, how are you going to be accountable? How are you going to improve what you do? How are we going to think about information as a commodity on these platforms where the money isn't transparent and the algorithms aren't transparent? So yes, I think let's definitely keep fighting that fight about, helping empower individuals, but let's not forget to bring in the big players and try to make big change, because I do think we can get there, but every day is a whole new ball game. So we just wake up and do it again with the new challenges. So I just appreciate being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Megan. Dear audience, we are going to close this session with a couple of sobering thoughts. I was reading one very interesting article which was published on 6th of August, and it was written by Associate Professor of Russian Literature, Ani Kokobobo from University of Kansas. And she teaches in Russian literature, and the title of her article is "How Should Dostoevsky and Lev Tolstoy Be Read During Russia's War Against Ukraine?" A wonderful piece. I highly recommend, and I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to quote just one small paragraph that she mentioned here, which touched my heart. And I'm going to paraphrase, read directly here, is that in one of his most famous pacifist writing of 1900s, Lev Tolstoy, the title was "Thou Shalt Not Kill," he precisely diagnosed the problem of today's Russia. The misery of nations is caused not by particular persons, but by the particular order of society under which the people are so bound up together that they find themselves all in the power of a few men, or more often in the power of one single man, a man so perverted by his unnatural position as arbiter of the fate and lives of millions that he is always in an unhealthy state and always suffers more or less from a mania of self-aggrandizement, unquote. And Alexei Navalny's, in his trial, he also quoted the same thing, and he said that, I'm quoting from the same article, as Leo Tolstoy, one of our great writers, whose quote I ended my speech with, bequeathed, "War is a product of despotism. Those who want to fight war must only fight despotism," unquote. So, the audience, we are working very hard to fight disinformation coming out of Russian mechanisms, machineries, social media, news and print media on Ukraine war. And as Dr. Megan rightly mentioned, we have to be aware, cautious, and she said that compassionate exchange and dialogue. This is what we all need in today's context. And I would like to just end by saying that keep fighting, keep resisting, and definitely we'll win someday. Thank you. Goodbye.